Talking about Senator Marco Rubio's Equitable Act, I think it requires the U.S. listed foreign companies to provide, if they don't provide eligible audits for 3 years, they will be delisted from the U.S. capital market. But 3 years, do you think that's too long?
Oh, I think I've said from day one, I think that is a compromise that it takes too long. I think these things ought to be, I think it ought to be more rigorous and go back immediately and do 3 years historical.
Okay.
And I think it ought to be a much shorter window of time. Remember, when you start talking about delisting and deregistering, that's when there's real meltdown, right? People get really upset because that's when they say, oh, these stocks could go to zero and that would affect pension funds. My point is, hey, it is what it is. You know, I worked at Goldman Sachs. I worked in corporate finance for a while before I was in M&A in the summer. You know, I worked in a number of IPOs. I've worked on IPOs in my own firm a number of times. You know, publicly traded securities, to me, there ought to be total transparency and they ought to have the exact same types of audits with the same rigor that companies in the West have. I think Rubio and what they've done, his staff is very smart. I think they've tried to give leeway, and even Kyle Bass says there's got to be some, you know, some rolling in of this, which I think is fair. I just think it could take too much. I don't think it ought to take 3 years. I think it ought to be much less. I think you tell people day one, hey, here's when it's got to be done, and you've got to go back and actually audit back for a couple of years so we know what that information is.
Do you think more legislation is needed in that regard?
It shouldn't take legislation. We have the Securities and Exchange Commission. I think what the Securities and Exchange Commission do is stop giving waivers and just treat these companies like all companies on these exchanges should be treated the same. I don't think there ought to be any of these waivers. I'm not so sure you actually need to go do a lot of legislation. My whole thing is that Jay Clayton and the Securities SEC, which is so all over everybody else, just sort of start holding these Chinese companies to the same standards. I'd like to know, I know it, but I think you can, that's an executive action you could take. First off, H&A. I mean, H&A is the largest financial company in the world. We have no earthly idea, right, of what the real ownership of that is, of how they've been financed, of who actually owns them. Is the Chinese people in Hanoi own them, or is Wan Xishan control these foundations in New York that controls them? Who controls them? Right? There's so many questions on on-bond insurance companies, all these on Huawei. We don't even know what the shareholding of Huawei is. There's all this basic just information that is known down to the 5th decimal place of American and European companies that to me should be standard for these companies in the CCP. So this is not singling them out for tougher restrictions. It's actually just having them everybody play on the same set of rules, and I think that has to happen. There's huge pushback on this already by the Wall Street faction, saying it'll screw up these companies, they'll trade differently, you have a big impact in the American pension funds that invest in them, it could take losses. So Rubio's thing has not been greeted with a warm embrace. I think he's got very few co-sponsors on his bill, so don't think the Equitable Act is going to be passed next week, because it's not.
It's not. It's never going to be passed.
I didn't say it was never going to be passed, but I'm saying it's not. Your audience shouldn't believe that because smart people and dedicated people like Senator Marco Rubio and staff put these forward, that there's just a rush up to say, oh, this is brilliant. Why didn't we think of that in a big rush to do this? Mm-hmm. Remember, people on Wall Street and in corporations kind of know what the scam is, right? The scam is to make the CCP have to deliver as little information as possible and accrete the most value, so then their partners can share in the prize. And that is what people like for the Democracy Act and Marco Rubio and different senators around there saying, hey, this has got to stop. We have to get into a system that is more about full disclosure. And this is what Roger Robinson is. And if your audience hasn't followed him, what Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass do every day on their Twitter feed and information they put out, they are relentless. One of the things in the Committee on the Present Danger, we're making a huge emphasis on the whole capital markets and financing aspect of this because nobody heretofore has really talked about it.
Mm-hmm. How do you hold SEC more accountable? They are not performing, and one of their excuses is we just don't have enough, power. We are trying to use a AK-47 to shoot down a satellite. We're just not up to them.
I don't believe that. I think they have all the power they need. They just have to act. If they need a different act like the Equitable Act or others, they ought to go back and get rid of these waivers, unwind what's been done before. But I think Jay Clayton, who's been, I think, a terrific head of the SEC. There just has to be more focus on this area. One of the reasons I don't think there's enough focus, hasn't been enough public awareness. This is why Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass, what they're doing is quite heroic. They're really, in the Committee on the Present Danger, one of the things I'm really proud of is now you see this every time. We're thinking of having another, meeting and conference up on Wall Street, which we did back in the spring to really, at the St. Regis Hotel, that really brought this to everybody's awareness. And we had this one the other day over at Hillsdale on Capitol Hill. And I think we're going to have another one because it just needs to be continually drilled into people's mind about what's going on here.